All right, this is for Anne. Since I'm not there, I'm going to keep reading to you. This is the third book of the Chronicles of Narnia. It's called The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. So we've got a map of Narnia. This is going to be important. I'll come back to that. Chapter 1, The Picture in the Bedroom. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. His parents called him Eustace Clarence, and masters called him Scrubb. I can't tell you how his friends spoke of him, for he had none. He didn't call his father and mother, but Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. In their house, there was a very little furniture and very few cloths on beds, and the windows were always open. Eustace Clarence liked animals, especially beetles, if they were dead and pinned on a card. He liked books if there were books on information and had pictures of grain elevators or fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools. Eustace Clarence disliked his cousins, the four Pevensies, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. But he was quite glad when he heard that Edmund and Lucy were coming to stay. For deep down inside of him, he liked bossing and bullying. And though he was a puny little person who couldn't have stood up to even Lucy, let alone Edmund, in a fight, he knew that there were dozens of ways to give people a very bad time if you're in your own home and they're your only visitors. There's Eustace, the not very nice guy. Edmund and Lucy did not at all want to come and stay with Uncle Harold and Aunt Alberta, but it couldn't really be helped. Father had got a job lecturing in America for 16 weeks that summer, and Mother had to go with him because she hadn't had a real holiday for 10 years. Peter was working very hard for an exam, and he was told to spend the holidays being coached by old Professor Kirk, in whose house the four children had wonderful adventures long ago in the war years. If he had still been in the house, he would have had them all to stay, but he had somehow become poor since the old days and lived in a small cottage with only one bedroom to spare. It would have cost too much to take the other three children all to America, and Susan was gone. Grown-ups thought her the pretty one of the family, and she was no good at schoolwork, though otherwise very old for her age. And Mother said she would get far more out of a trip to America than the youngsters. Edmund and Lucy tried not to grudge Susan her luck, but it was dreadful having to spend summer holidays at their aunt's. But it's far worse for me, said Edmund, because you'll at least have a room of your own, and I shall have to share a bedroom with the record stinker Eustace. That story began the very afternoon when Edmund and Lucy were stealing a few precious minutes alone together. And of course they were talking about Narnia, which was the name of their own very private and secret country. Most of us, I suppose, have a secret country, but for most of us, it's only an imaginary country. Edmund and Lucy were luckier than other people in that respect. Their secret country was real. They had already visited it twice, not in a game or a dream, but in reality. They had got there, of course, by magic, which is the only way of getting to Narnia. And a promise, or very nearly a promise, had been made in Narnia itself that they would someday get back. You may imagine that they talked about it a good deal when they got a chance. There in Lucy's room, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at a picture on the opposite wall, it was the only picture in the house that they liked, and Aunt Alberta didn't like it at all. That was why she put it in the little back bedroom upstairs. But she couldn't get rid of it because it had been a wedding present from someone she did not want to offend. It was the picture of a ship sailing straight towards you. Her prow was gilded and shaped with the head of a dragon with a wide open mouth. She had only one mast and one large square sail, which was a rich purple. The sides of the ship, what you could see of them, were gilded wings, where the gilded wings of the dragon ended, were green. She had just run up to the top of one glorious blue wave, and the nearest slope of that came down on you with streaks and bubbles on it. She was obviously running fast before a gay wind, listing over a little to her port side. By the way, if you're going to read the story at all, and if you don't already know, you'd better get it into your head that the left side of the ship when you're looking ahead is port, and the right is starboard. All the sunlight fell on her from that side, and the water on that side was full of greens and purples. On the other, it was a darker blue from the shadow of the ship. The question is, said Edmund, whether it doesn't make things worse looking at a Narnian ship when you can't get there. Even looking is better than nothing, said Lucy, and she is such a Narnian ship. Still playing your old game, said Eustace Clarence, who had listened at the door and now came grinning into the room. Last year, when he'd been staying with the Pevensies, he had managed to hear them all talking about Narnia, and he loved teasing them about it. He thought, of course, that they were all making it up, and he was far too stupid to make up anything for himself, and he did not approve of that. You're not wanted here, said Edmund curtly. I'm trying to think of a limerick, said Eustace, something like, some kids who play games about Narnia got gradually balmier and balmier. Well, Narnia and balmier don't rhyme to begin with, said Lucy. It's an assonance, said Eustace. Don't ask him what the assy thingamajiggy is, said Edmund. He's only longing to be asked. Say nothing and perhaps he'll go away. Most boys, on meeting a reception like this, would either have cleared out or flared up. Eustace did neither. He just hung about grinning and presently began talking again. Do you like the picture? He asked. Oh, for heaven's sake, don't let him start about art and all of that, said Edmund hurriedly. But Lucy, who was very truthful, had already said, yes, I do. I like it very much. It's a rotten picture, said Eustace. And you won't see it if you step outside, said Edmund. Why do you like it? Said Eustace to Lucy. Well, for one thing, said Lucy, I like it because the ship looks very much like it's moving, and the water looks as if it were really wet. And the waves look as if they were really going up and down. Of course, Eustace had lots of answers to this, but he didn't say anything. The reason was that at that very moment, he looked at the waves and saw that they did very much indeed look as if they were going up and down. And he had only once been in a ship, and then it was only as far as the Isle of Wight, and had been horribly seasick. The look of the waves in the picture made him feel sick again, and he turned rather green and tried another look. And then all three children were staring with open mouths. What they were seeing may be hard to believe when you read it in print, but it was almost as if hard to believe if you saw it happening. The things in the pictures were moving, and it didn't look like a cinema at all. The colors were too real and clean and out of doors for that. Down went the prow of the ship into the wave, and then up with a great shock of spray. And then went the wave behind her, and her stern and her deck became visible for the very first time, and then disappeared as the next wave came up to meet her, and their bows went up again. And at the same moment of the exercise book, which had been laying beside Edmund on the bed, flapped and rose and sailed through the air to the wall behind them. And Lucy felt all her hair whipping round her face as it does on a windy day. And this was a windy day, but the wind was blowing out of the picture towards them. And then, suddenly, with the wind came noises. The swishing of waves and the slap of the water against the sea sides and the creaking and all over steady high roar of the air and water. But it was the smell. The wild, briny smell which really convinced Lucy that she was not dreaming. Stop it, cried Eustace's voice, squeaking with a frightened bad temper. It's some silly trick you two are playing. Stop it. I'll tell Roberta. Ow! The other two were much more accustomed to adventures, but just exactly as Eustace Clarence said ow, they both said ow too. And the reason was a great cold salt splash had broken right out of the frame, and they were breathless from the smack of it, and besides being wet through. I'll smash the rotten thing, called Eustace, and then several things happened all at the same time. Eustace rushed towards the picture. Edmund, who knew something about magic, sprang after him, warning him to look out and not to be a fool, and Lucy grabbed him from the other side and was being dragged forward. And by this time, either they had grown much smaller or the picture had grown much bigger. Eustace jumped and tried to pull it off the wall and found himself standing on the frame. And in front of him was not glass, but real sea. And wind and waves rushed through the frame as if they might on a rock. He lost his head and clutched at the other two who had jumped up beside him. There was a second of struggling and shouting. And just as they thought they had got their balance, and the great blue roller surged around them and swept them off their feet and drew them down into the sea. Eustace's despairing cry ended as the water got into his mouth. Here's a picture of the children getting swept into the picture and into the sea. Lucy thanked her stars that she had worked hard on her swimming the last summer term. It's true that she would have gotten better if she had used a slower stroke, and also if the water felt a good deal colder than it was when it looked like it was only a picture. Still, she kept her head and kicked her shoes off, as everyone ought to do who falls into deep water in their clothes. She even kept her mouth shut and her eyes open. They were still quite near the ship, and she saw its green sides towering high above them, and people looking at her from the deck. Then, as one might have expected, Eustace clutched at her in panic, and down they both went. And then they came up again, and she saw a white figure diving off the ship's side. Edmund was close beside her now, treading water, and had caught the arms of the howling Eustace. Then someone else, whose face was vaguely familiar, slipped an arm under her side from the other side, and there was a lot of shouting going on from the ship, heads crowding together on the bulwarks, ropes being thrown, and Edmund and the stranger were fastening ropes around her. And then that followed what seemed to be a very long delay, during which her face got blue and her teeth began chattering. In reality, the delay was not very long. They were waiting until the moment when she could get on board the ship without being dashed against the side. Even with all their best endeavors, she had a bruised knee when she finally stood dripping and shivering on the deck. After her, Edmund was heaved up, and then the miserable Eustace. Last of all came the stranger, a golden-haired boy some years older than herself. Caspian! Gasped Lucy as soon as she had breath enough, for Caspian it was. Caspian, the boy king of Narnia, whom they had helped set on the throne during their last visit. Immediately Edmund recognized him too. All three shook hands and clapped each other on the back in great delight. Here's a picture of all of them meeting together. "But who is your friend?" said Caspian almost at once, turning to Eustace with his cheerful smile. But Eustace was crying much harder than any boy his age had the right to cry when nothing was worse than a wedding had happened to him, and would only yell out, let me go back, I don't like it." "Let you go," said Caspian. "But where?" Eustace rushed to the ship's side as if he expected to see the picture frame hanging above the sea, and perhaps a glance of Lucy's bedroom. But all he saw were blue waves flecked with foam and the paler blue sky spreading both without break on the horizon. Perhaps we cannot hardly blame him if his heart sank. He was promptly sick. "Hey, Renef," said Caspian to one of the sailors, "bring spiced wine for their majesties. You'll need something warm after that dip." He called Edmund and Lucy their majesties because they and Peter and Susan had all been kings and queens of Narnia long before his time. Narnia's time flowed differently than our eyes. If you spent 100 years in Narnia, you would still come back to our world at the very same hour, the very same day that you left. And then, if you went back to Narnia after spending a week there, you might find 1,000 Narnian years had passed, or only a day, or no time at all. You never knew till you got there. Consequently, when the Pevensey children had returned to Narnia the last time for their second visit, it was, for the Narnians, as if King Arthur had come back to Britain, as some people say he will, and I say, the sooner the better. Renef returned with spiced wine steaming in a flagon and 4 silver cups. It was just what one wanted, and as Lucy and Edmund sipped it, they could feel the warmth going right down to their toes. But Eustace made faces and spluttered and spat it out and then got sick again and began to cry again and asked if they hadn't any of Plumptree's vitamized nerve food and could it be made with distilled water, and anyway he insisted on being put ashore at the very next station. "This is a merry shipmate you've brought to us, brother," whispered Caspian to Edmund with a chuckle. But before he could say any more, Eustace burst out again. What on earth is that? Take it away! Take away this horrid thing!" He really had some excuse this time for feeling a little surprised. Something very curious indeed had come out of the cabin in the poop and was slowly approaching them. You might call it, and indeed it was, a mouse. But it was a mouse on its hind legs and stood about 2 feet tall. A thin band of gold passed around its head, under one ear and over the other, and it was stuck with a very long crimson feather. And the mouse's fur was very dark, almost black, and the effect was bold and striking. In its left paw rested the hilt of a sword very nearly as long as its tail. Its balance, as it paced gravely along the swaying deck, was perfect, and its manners courtly. Lucy and Edmund recognized it at once. Reepicheep, the most valiant of all the talking beasts of Narnia and the chief mouse. It had won undying glory in the second battle of Baruna. Lucy longed, as she had always done, to take Reepicheep up in her arms and cuddle him. But this, as she well knew, was a pleasure she could never have. It would have offended him deeply. Instead, she went down on one knee to talk to him. And this is what Reepicheep looked like, with his beautiful long feather coming off his hair. Reepicheep put forward his left leg and drew his right and bowed, kissing her hand and straightening himself, twirling his whiskers, and said in a shrill, piping voice, "My humble duty to your majesty and to the King Edmund too." Here he bowed again. "Nothing except your majesty's presence was lacking to this glorious venture." "Ugh, take it away," wailed Eustace. "I hate mice, and I could never bear performing animals. They're silly and vulgar and sentimental." "Am I to understand," said Reepicheep to Lucy after a long stare at Eustace, "that this singularly discourteous person is under your majesty's protection? Because if not..." At that moment, Lucy and Edmund both sneezed. "What a fool I am to keep you all standing here in your wet things," said Caspian. "Come below and get changed. I'll give my cabin, of course, to Lucy, but I'm afraid we have no women's clothes on board. You'll have to make do with some of mine. Lead the way, Reepicheep, like a good fellow." "To the convenience of the lady," said Reepicheep. "Even a question of honor must give way, at least for the moment." And here he looked hard at Eustace. But Caspian hustled them on, and in a few minutes Lucy found herself passing through the door of the stern of the cabin. She fell in love with it at once. The 3 square windows looked out into the blue swirling water astern, and the low cushioned benches round 3 sides of the tables, where the swinging lamp overhead, dwarf's work, she knew at once by its exquisite delicacy, the flat gold image of Aslan the lion on the forward wall of the door. All of this she took in in a flash, for Caspian immediately opened the door on the starboard side and said, "This'll be your room, Lucy. I'll just get some dry things for myself," and he rummaged in one of the lockers as he spoke, "and then leave you to change. If you'll fling your wet things outside the door, I'll get them taken to the galley to be tried." So Lucy found herself much at home, as if she had been in Caspian's cabin for weeks. The motion of the ship did not worry her, for in the old days, when she was a queen of Narnia, she had done a good deal of voyaging. The cabin was very tiny, but bright with painted panels, all birds and beasts and crimson dragons and vines, and spotlessly clean. Caspian's clothes were too big for her, but she could manage. His shoes and sandals and sea boots were hopelessly big, but she did not mind going barefoot on board the ship. When she had finished dressing, she had looked out the window at the water rushing past and took a long, deep breath. She felt quite sure that they were in for a lovely time. Here is a picture of Lucy getting dressed in Caspian's cabin, and this is the end of chapter 1.